Just before, leading into my introduction to the next speaker, please indulge me. I just want to add one comment to John's presentation. So, extra background to our research on New Zealand. I trawled through the archives on their IPA emails, and I found a message that I sent to the IPA team on the 28th of June 2021. It was a hyperlink to an opinion article containing a comment by me. It said, "Interesting article comparing the idea of a voice to a tribunal in New Zealand, which is doing some really shocking things." And that was in an understated way, but really brought the idea of this Waitangi tribunal to my attention. It was the spark that John was able to turn into a flame that has been so important. But that article was an article published at Quadrant. Its headline was, "Maori activists set an example for Australia," and the author was Douglas Drummond, who I have the pleasure of introducing to you right now. In a long and influential legal career, the Honourable Douglas Drummond King's Counsel has been the senior counsel to the Queensland Government's Fitzgerald inquiry, following which he was appointed a special prosecutor, which helped secure the prosecution of former Police Chief Terry Lewis, among many others. Following that, in 1991, he was the president of the Queensland Bar Association, and from November 1991 to April 2003, he was a Justice of the Federal Court of Australia. More recently, he's been a commentator on publications such as Quadrant, which, as I mentioned before, has been so valuable to me. I also just want to make one more comment, if I can be so gratuitous. I feel a kind of ancient connection to Doug. Obviously we have Beg, Drummond, Scottish names, but what you might not know about the Scottish clan system is that Clan Beg is actually just a small part of the larger Clan Drummond. The first chief of Clan Drummond was one Malcolm Beg, and so closely related are these clans that we have the same motto, and the motto is "Gang warily." Now, translated broadly, that means proceed with caution, and I suspect we may just get a message of caution from his presentation today.
Thank you, Morgan. The Clan Drummond motto, "Gang warily, proceed with caution," it has a certain connotation, but when you put it in context, it has a different connotation. It was adopted by the clan to commemorate the fact that it was them who devised the hidden stakes into which the English cavalry rode to their destruction at Bannockburn. Now, I want to speak about the Aboriginal reconquest of Australia. The Spaniards took nearly 700 years to complete their reconquest. In 1492, they finally drove out their Muslim invaders from the last stronghold in Grenada. The Aboriginal reconquest of Australia is underway. It will take much less time. It proceeds apace. The Spaniards had some outside help, but had to rely largely on themselves. In contrast, the Aboriginal reconquest has the support of an embarrassment of collaborators. All governments, federal and state, have long been eager collaborators with our local reconquest. The federal government's voice referendum is the most prominent current example. Prime Minister Albanese still says the Uluru Statement from the Heart, calling for the voice, is a generous and polite offer by Indigenous peoples. He praises the poetry of the Uluru Statement. The statement is the first page of the Referendum Council final report, which is a list of grievances of First Nations peoples and demands for how those grievances should be rectified. There are a lot of demands, but not much poetry in the final report. Key demands are set out in section 2.2.3. Firstly, a constitutionally entrenched voice to Parliament that must also be supported by a sufficient and guaranteed budget with access to its own independent secretariat, experts and lawyers. That's a new bureaucracy. A demand for the voice to be able to make representations to the executive government from the Governor and Council down to public servants, now included in the proposed amendment to the Constitution, emerged later from the government's referendum working group. The report also says that the voice could represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples internationally. Foreign Minister Wong and Senator Pat Dodson, the Special Envoy for Reconciliation and Implementation of the Uluru Statement, haven't waited for the referendum. They appointed Mr Justin Mohammed as Australia's inaugural ambassador for First Nations people back in March. The ambassador is supported by $2 million in the current National Indigenous Australian Agency budget. His mission statement is to take Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and experiences to the world. Secondly, a treaty. Makarrata, says the report, is another word for treaty or agreement making. It is the culmination of our agenda. Treaty, the report continues, would be a vehicle to achieve self-determination, autonomy and self-government. A treaty could include a proper say in decision-making, the establishment of a truth commission, reparations, a settlement, the resolution of land, water and resources issues, recognition of authority and customary law. The settlement envisaged is a financial one that could include a percentage of GDP to be allocated to and administered by First Nations. Thirdly, truth-telling. The true history of colonisation must be told. The genocides, the massacres, the wars and the ongoing injustices and discrimination. We are told by voice supporters that all it can do is offer advice, which any government can ignore, and that the Parliament will be able to reform or reshape the body any way it likes. They and the Prime Minister ignore the demand for power in the Uluru Statement. It says we seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. The statement makes no bones about what it wants to achieve: power. Pat Anderson is co-chair of the Referendum Council that produced the Uluru Statement, and she's a member of the Referendum Working Group that's provided advice to government on the proposed constitutional amendment and referendum question. She doesn't shy away from the demand for power. She says, it is not a big ask. Yes, it has to have some power, and you will give us the power when you vote yes. Voice activists have refused to be deflected from that power objective. As one of the questioners mentioned, Attorney General Griffith met members of the Referendum Working Group on 9 March to ask that some words be added to one of the referendum questions to guard against potential High Court challenges arising out of the role of the voice in being able to make representations to the executive government. The Attorney General gave the working group an advice by the Solicitor General that must have supported his request. That advice has never been made public. What the Solicitor General said about Dreyfus's concerns is not mentioned in his advice released on 19 April. The working group told the Attorney General to go away. They wouldn't accept any restriction on the power offered by the opportunity to delay government action by consultation and litigation that is now within their grasp. From the 1970s, each Australian government has passed laws that gave ministers discretionary power to protect places of significance to Aboriginal culture and traditions, with the courts having jurisdiction to review ministerial compliance. The Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act 2021 of Western Australia came into force in July, broke new ground. It transferred from the Minister to Aboriginal bodies much of the authority to ban or approve activities on any land greater in size than 1,100 square metres if it was claimed by them to be of Aboriginal cultural significance. The Act also required landowners to pay fees to those bodies for heritage surveys. The public outcry frightened the politicians. in the first setback the Aboriginal reconquest has suffered, the West Australian Premier has now announced a decision to overturn the new Act and to restore the original 1972 Act with some unspecified amendments. The courts too have been supportive of the extension of Aboriginal power. The Federal Court in 1993 showed its respect for Aboriginal beliefs in imaginary Dreamtime serpents in a case arising out of the redevelopment of a brewery on the Swan River in Perth. The decision turned on the Commonwealth's Aboriginal Heritage Protection Act, passed in 1984. An Aboriginal opposed the brewery development. He said the site was sacred in local Aboriginal belief to a rainbow serpent because it was on the path taken by the serpent in a Dreamtime journey, during which it created the river. It was also sacred because it was said to be a place for the rituals necessary to be performed to pay respect to that imaginary serpent. The minister's approval of the extensions to the brewery was overturned by the court, which held that he'd not properly considered whether the redevelopment would fail to protect the site from injury or desecration. What some may think odd was that the court did not say that there was any evidence that such rituals continued to be performed there, nor did it refer to any evidence that the private, commercial and government activities on the site during the previous 160 years, including government stores buildings, a tannery, a commercial flour mill, and finally the brewery, had disrupted the performance of any rituals or resulted in any harm to any of the local Aborigines. Continued observance of traditional practices, so necessary for proof of native title, was unnecessary. Later cases have shown similar respect for Aboriginal beliefs. The most recent was in April last. The State Administrative Tribunal of Western Australia, presided over by a judge of that state's Court of Appeal, gave a decision on the West Australian Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act of 1972. A pastoral company sought permission to improve its pastoral holding by building weirs on a river in its property in the Pilbara. The tribunal refused approval. A central conclusion was this: we found that interfering with the natural flow of the river will cause spiritual harm to the Thalangi people by virtue of their concern that the water snake may die or leave the river or become angry. It's extraordinary the hold that Aboriginal culture now has on many Australians. The Uluru Statement says we seek constitutional reforms to empower our people, and their culture will be a gift to the country. A former High Court Chief Justice supporting the Voice said last March that Aboriginals are the bearers of a rich culture expressed in dreaming stories, art, song and ceremony of which all Australians can be proud. The Queensland Government has now legislated to acknowledge, as part of its push for treaties, that the enduring culture, law and knowledge of Aboriginal peoples are priceless assets for Queensland. The anthropologist Bill Stanner coined the term the Great Australian Silence in his Boyer lectures in 1968. He was referring to the silence up to then about the Aborigines in Australian history writing. We are now living through a second Great Australian Silence, in which the damaging practices in Indigenous culture, still prevalent, are studiously ignored. Belief in sorcery remains widespread. It is the subject of an advice to medical staff by the Queensland Department of Health in its 2015 publication, Sad News, Sorry Business. Belief in sorcery, says the publication, is as real to many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a blocked artery, and should not be dismissed as mere superstition. The belief continues to inhibit delivery of Western medical treatments. An ABC report in June 2018 entitled Curses, Black Magic and Witch Doctors, Ancient Beliefs at Large in remote Northern Territory communities, said this: "Earlier this month, it was the Angarugu School and Centrelink office on Groote Island that fell victim to a curse, forcing them both to close for 2 weeks. The perpetrator was believed to be a man in a bad mood following an argument with his wife. These curses were eventually lifted by a smoking ceremony. Child marriage and associated child sexual abuse, both culturally approved, continue in remote communities. See the Northern Territory Court of Appeal decision in the Queen v GJ in 2005. Demand sharing or humbugging, part of the once nomadic Aboriginal culture, remains rife. It was central to the High Court decision in ASIC against Cobalt in 2019. It's a cause of the often gross overcrowding in Aboriginal housing. It also destroys the impulse to better oneself by one's own efforts. Kin-driven nepotism is also rife. It ensures that only the kin group members benefit from the millions of government grants and mining company payments to Aboriginal-controlled organisations. In 2020, Mark Kilmartry, the chairman of the Tribal Owners of South Australia, called for a judicial inquiry into the governance of Aboriginal corporations to try to stop the widespread corruption, incompetence and nepotism. Professor Marsha Langton spoke on ABC Q&A in 2016 of violence against Indigenous women, which ranges between 34 times the national figures to, in the worst cases, in the worst areas, 80 times. A 2015 Queensland Government Domestic Violence Task Force report, Not Now, Not Ever, commented on this violence and said that plainly the most common pattern of domestic and family violence is that it is committed by men against women. The Aboriginal communities themselves and the media have shown little interest in that, preferring to concentrate on the rare police shootings of Aboriginal men. As Justice Judith Kelly of the Northern Territory Supreme Court said in a speech in August 2022, an Aboriginal man's life is still valued much more highly than a woman's. The currently fashionable explanation for this violence is the newly discovered condition of intergenerational trauma caused by white colonisation. It's said to explain why so many men in remote communities can't help themselves injuring and killing their women in such large numbers. But given the persistence of cultural behaviours, the violent misogyny so widespread in Aboriginal communities is more likely explained in large part by its long-enduring entrenchment in traditional culture and by the effects of relatively recent colonisation. There's evidence of this misogynistic violence in skeletal remains from across Australia going back 50,000 years. And there's also evidence of it in the observations of First Fleet officers, including Watkin Tench, who was shocked in 1788 at the savage barbarity, his words, with which the men routinely treated their women. There is much evidence of it in 19th century settler writings. The Queensland Task Force report noted the same evidence, that most of the violence was committed by men against women. Professor Peter Sutton, who has long lived in and studied remote communities, says in his book The Politics of Suffering, today this kind of assault is found at its worst in communities that have remained closest to their cultural traditions and where alcohol is available in quantity. Other collaborators in the Aboriginal reconquest include governments in Victoria, Queensland and the Northern Territory. These governments are pushing ahead with the legally curious business of making treaties on behalf of all their citizens with those who say they are Indigenous. Part of this push includes what is called truth-telling. Queensland Parliament, like the proposed voice, wants this, and it has in fact legislated for a truth-telling and healing inquiry to inquire into the impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal peoples, Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the history of Queensland. The fashion for truth-telling comes from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, set up in 1996 after the end of apartheid. In that commission, people who'd been tortured told of their experience in public, the torturers were identified, and if they confessed, they were given indemnities from prosecution, as well as forgiveness by their victims. That is why the South African experiment had some success in achieving a degree of reconciliation between black and white South Africans, though resurgent tribalism is eroding those gains. Neither of those conditions can be satisfied in Australia now, of course. All victims and all perpetrators are long dead. As the historian John Hurst reminds us, in 1999, David Malouf and Jackie Huggins, working for the Reconciliation Council, presented to Prime Minister Howard a draft Declaration of Reconciliation. It said, as one part of the nation expresses its sorrow and profoundly regrets the injustices of the past, so the other part accepts the apology and forgives. It took until 2008 for a Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, to make an apology. But so far as I know, no one has accepted it or expressed any forgiveness. Reconciliation, whatever it means, is as far away as ever. Any possibility that problems in Indigenous communities might in part, at least, be culturally determined will be ignored. The truth-telling inquiry will look once again at the frontier massacres and the land seizures and at the stolen children. I say once again because since 2011, the national curriculum has required the teaching of colonial frontier history, including the massacres in our schools. Stories from the stolen generations in Australia have also formed an integral part of the curriculum in Australian primary and secondary schools for many years. It must be hard to find anyone in Queensland or anywhere else unaware of the Stolen Generations report and the associated federal and state government apologies, annual sorry days, and most recently, compensation schemes for people claiming to be stolen children. The inquiry will almost certainly look at the high imprisonment rates of Aborigines. Black death in custody remains contentious. This may be because the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission did not deliver the verdict activists wanted and are still demanding. Unlike the Stolen Generations report, the Black Deaths Royal Commission did carefully investigate and test the claims of racial violence by police and prison officials. It began its final report with this statement: the conclusions reached in this report will not accord with the expectations of those who anticipated that findings of foul play would be inevitable and frequent. That is not the conclusion which the Commission has reached. As reported in the individual case reports, Commissioners did not find that the deaths were the product of deliberate violence or brutality by police or prison officers. Those who control the planned truth-telling process will no doubt have another go at trying to convince the public that continuing Indigenous deaths in custody result from the impacts of colonialism and entrenched racism. The high rates of offending, particularly by men who attack their women partners, are never mentioned as a possible explanation for the high imprisonment rates. The often poor health of offenders on admission to prison as a possible explanation for continuing black deaths in custody will be ignored. The public services are eager collaborators in the reconquest. I'll mention a couple of examples from the myriad available. In March 2021, the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service Regional Director issued a public safety warning. It said that some campsites were being closed to reduce the potential for further negative interactions and ensure the long-term viability of the Wangari population on Kagari. It followed a dingo attack on a child on Fraser Island. The use of bachelor words no doubt showed the regional director's respect for the island's traditional owners. But few people understood where and by what the negative interactions were taking place. As a safety warning, it's been a failure. It was quickly followed by a number of similar attacks, the most recent in early August. Government bureaucrats around Australia have placed bans on climbing various natural features, as a result of Aboriginal agitation. The usual formula for justifying these bans is that public access is neither culturally appropriate nor physically safe. The Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, for example, in its latest update, stated that the Glasshouse Mountain, a popular climbing site, is closed until further notice for cultural healing, whatever that may be. A few years back, CSIRO, the nation's premier scientific research body, made a kowtow to Aboriginal culture, singularly bizarre even for modern Australian bureaucrats. It celebrated the opening of a new scientific laboratory in Canberra with a smoking ceremony. Its Indigenous engagement protocol, issued in November 2010, set out instructions about when and how CSIRO should arrange smoking ceremonies. This protocol informed us that the ceremony aims to cleanse the place of evil spirits in which the ceremony takes place. I say the protocol informed us because it's now been withdrawn. The ridicule that CSIRO attracted hurt. As I've mentioned, this particular protocol has disappeared from its website. Time is what can be said about the many collaborators in Australian business and public organisations. The universities have long been hotbeds of Aboriginal activism. One deserves special mention. The University of New South Wales considers it inappropriate to say that Australian history commences 65,000 years ago, with the long settlement of Australia's Indigenous peoples. This university's language advice for staff says it is more appropriate to say that Aborigines have been here since the beginning of the dreaming, because this reflects the beliefs of many Indigenous Australians that they've always been in Australia from the beginning of time and came from the land. I doubt that any of the annual New College lectures at that university, with their focus on theology, show the same respect for Christian creation myths. The Spanish Reconquista replaced Islamic religious beliefs with those of the then strong Catholic religion. With the decline in Christian belief, the human need for something outside our material world seems to be fulfilled for many Australians by the belief that the Australian continent was an Antipodean Eden in which 500 or so different tribes lived in peace and harmony until the fall occurred in 1788. This myth has taken firm root in white consciousness. Professor Mick Dodson told a credulous National Press Club in 2002, violence is not and never was part of Aboriginal tradition. Most of the violence, if not all, that Aboriginal communities are experiencing today are not part of Aboriginal tradition or culture. The federal politician and university graduate Zali Steggall has called for a minute's silence during official Australia Day celebrations in recognition of the Indigenous Australians' lives lost since January 1788. While it marks the commencement of European colonisation, she said, it also represents the commencement of violence. This myth is of recent origin. Geoffrey Blaney, writing in 2015, said that tribal warfare now tends to be denied or completely ignored in certain academic circles. He continued, during the last 40 years, there has arisen the competing idea that Aborigines live peacefully with each other. Serious newspapers and schools too have adopted this idea. People in earlier times were more realistic. Queensland Native Police provides a good example. The 1861 report of the Select Committee of the Queensland Legislative Assembly on the Native Police recommended that troopers be recruited from areas remote from where they were to serve. This practice was followed to take advantage of the lack of any sympathy by Aboriginals for other Aboriginals who were not of their kin group. In 2014, two Queensland historians made a rough estimate that 41,000, the majority of Aboriginals killed between 1859 and 1898, on the fast-moving Queensland frontier were killed by native troopers, with settlers killing another 20,000. The native troopers appear to have been enthusiastic killers. An 1880 report reported that the testimony of everyone, officers and civilians, was unanimous in saying that though courageous and daring in a wonderful manner, they were the most cruel, bloodthirsty savages, altogether relentless in their warfare against their countrymen. Colonial Australia was not an Eden by any means. If the yes campaign in the referendum succeeds, we are going to be in very choppy waters. If the no campaign succeeds, that will set back, I think, the Aboriginal reconquest. It'll delay it, but I don't think it'll destroy it. Aboriginal activists and their supporters have been pushing continuously for the last 50 years. I don't think that they're going to give up even if the no campaign succeeds. Thank you.